I will introduce Professor Sandy Kedar. Sandy he teaches at the Law School at the University of Haifa. He holds a doctorate in law from Harvard Law School. He was a visiting professor at the University of Michigan Law School, as well as the Grotius International Law visiting scholar there and visiting associate professor at the Frankel Institute for Judaic Studies in the University of Michigan. Sandy's research focuses on legal geography, legal history, law, and society, and land regimes in settler societies and in Israel. He serves as the president of the Israeli Law and Society Association, is the coordinator of the Legal Geography CRN of the Law and Society Association, and a member of its international committee. He is the co-founder in 2003 and director of the Association for Distributive Justice, an Israeli NGO addressing these issues. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to share my PowerPoint. It's okay?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much for initiating this important event or the series of events. And I'm very happy to present today. What I would like to do is actually give a short overview of a work in progress. It's actually an article. I'm the co-author, the principal author is my PhD student, Quamar Mishirqi-Assad, and we are working together on this issue. And what we are doing actually is trying to show in a case study that is situated in a place called Shafa-Yatta or Susya. I'll show you later the region, but you can see it here. Can you see my cursor here? Moving? No. Rotate. Mouse. Can you see it now? Moving? Okay. So it's part of a larger project I'm working on, which is examining the legal geography of the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm very happy to say that it was founded last year by the Israel Science Foundation, which means that there are some issues. It was before our new Minister of Higher Education, so I'm not sure it would have been founded this year, but at least it is funded by the Israel Science Foundation. And I work within a general attempt to understand the transformation of the occupied territory through the interaction of law and the geography, on how law and geography interact in a way to change the place, and I will explain in a few minutes the story. And I work within keywords or paradigms that will not have time to dwell on, like colonialism, settler colonialism, occupation, settlements, apartheid. More and more, I think apartheid is a good way to describe what's going on in the occupied territories, and indigeneity and other key concepts. So I will skip because of time constraint, the general social sciences or approaches to analyze the regime in the occupied territories. But I will say that when we look at the situation in the occupied territories, it is clear that by general view, land in the occupied territories stands at the epicenter of the very, very convoluted conflict between Israelis / Jews and Palestinians from early on until today. And the most apparent situation of the conflict now is, or the most lively part is in the occupied territories. And coming from a legal perspective, I find that it is very surprising that by and large, no property scholar engage in a comprehensive analysis of the land regime in the occupied territories. There are few people that have written on it. I will show it mostly from, I would say, legal international law perspective, but very few property scholars have done it, and even so, very few from, I would say, a really critical perspective of working with the paradigm that I'm using. When I'm talking about land regime, I think about something that is larger than land or property. I think about this set of ideas, principles, norms, laws, institutions, decision-making processes, and practice that regulate land or spatial relationship, determine land allocation, use, dispossession, and ownership, and control and interrelate with the socio-political regime. And as I said, we have we lack research because while the political, historical, religious, and symbolic dimension of this conflict are important in their own right, as I said, the heart of the conflict is about territory, space, place, and laws that are shaping the land regime. And very few scholars have researched the land situation there. If you want, I can expand on this who research in the Q&A, but I would like to focus on the area we are researching. And here is Susya. This is area that is focusing in really at the southern part of the occupied territories, almost on the green line. And what I want to say is that when you look at the legal geography as a key to analyze the situation, it is interesting that despite its enormous potential as a scholarly framework to examine these territorial and legal conflict, practically no legal scholar has adopted a legal geography approach to study the issue. So I will not have time to talk about legal geography. I will refer to two work I'm involved in. One is a book I co-edited with colleagues on legal geography, and the other one is a book we co-authored on the legal geography of the land dispute between Israel and the Negev Bedouins, the Bedouins of the Negev. It will suffice for my presentation here to talk and give only one example for people to understand what we're talking about legal geography. And I want to talk about Jerusalem as one example on the interaction between law and space and how they're shaping each other. So I think many of you are aware of it. In 1967, Israel annexed the Jordanian Jerusalem and many additional municipalities that had no connection to, no formal connection to the Jordanian municipality, and established what is called the whole and unified Jerusalem. So this is, in a way, a creation made by drawing a legal line on a map and designating it, and then after that, even enacting it in basic law Jerusalem. You can see here the Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem that is huge, has nothing to do, if you want, with any urban entity before 1967. It never existed before. Now, the unification itself, which, as I argue, is a legal and spatial move, influenced then the location of settlements, neighborhood in the next area, because when we see when the new settlements were established, they were established mostly within the desire to Judaize Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem. It influenced the route, not completely, but influenced the route of the separation barrier, the legal status of Palestinian living in Jerusalem, and transformed separate areas into a new consensual a urban entity, at least within the Jewish population, that never existed before. So we can see how there is an interaction, interrelation between the two. Now, when we look at, I'm moving now to a major part of the presentation, and I would say that the legal situation in the occupied territory is very complex, and it's based on different layers, an Ottoman, a British mandate, a Jordanian, and Israeli, in the sense that the Knesset is sometimes legislating directly on the occupied territories, rules enacted by the military commander, international law, maybe some customary law, and so on. And Israel uses various means to overtake Palestinian land. In another article we're working on right now, we examine informal means. For example, the way, that the settlers are physically prevented the Palestinian owners to reach their land, and what happens after a while to this land. So it's we work with now we're working with a paradigm that is using also views on vigilantism, vigilance as a way, the interaction between the formal and informal actions, but this is not this paper. This paper is looking at the formal means, and the major means are declaration of state land, expropriation, and then allocation of what has become state land to Jews, to settlers. So these things are working to the argument to change the geography of the occupied territories, and specifically in our case, in Susya. So when we look at Susya, we did this examination, as I said, in a specific area, Susya, which spans over approximately 9,000 metric dunam, and currently lays between the Jewish settlement of Susya and the outpost called Mitzpeh that did not exist before, but now it's there. And we analyze the formal legal proceeding that took place in these areas until the establishment of the settlement, mostly land expropriation and declaration of state land, and ways the legal processes that were implemented thereafter. And we show how the application of legal tools led to gradual eviction of Palestinian residents and the seizure of their land, and the establishment of the settlement, and restrict and break up in the local space and Palestinian society. But we must say that we don't think that the Palestinians are just passive, but they are also resisting this process. So we have an interaction between space, place, law, persons, and so on. So this is, we've seen Susya. This is aerial photography of Susya and several of the settlements and outposts. This is the settlement Susya, and we can also see what is in blue is the state land. This is the research area, and we can see that most of it is in area C, but it's borders on also on area A, on area B. So, and if you look a little bit more, there is also some not far away that is area A. So it's also representative in that sense. First we look at this place. What is this place? So this place is called Shafa-Yatta, Yata, which is a high place, and it's composed of several small localities in the region. And starting there in the 1980s, they were enclosed between, as I said, the Jewish settlement of Susya a Mitzpeh outpost, and also an archaeological site. Susya is an important Jewish and other archaeological sites. So we tried to figure out what was going on. Where did these Palestinian settlements rise or arrive? And we discovered that there is an absence also of research, which is also part of the story. As in other places, most research, let's say historical, geographical, archaeological, focuses on Jewish and also on Christian remains. So, and also from the perspective of mostly Christian and Jewish researchers, Palestinian localities, the way some of them are living in caves, are not considered to be villages in the Western eyes. We've seen the same process regarding the Bedouin encampments in the Negev in the book we researched. And most of the research that was done is on what is called in Hebrew, Da'et ha'oyev, know your enemy. So it kind of people that are interested coming from intelligent perspective. And there was some research on spatial developments and Palestinian living, what is called their mother villages and settlement in caves. But we know that the area was divided through property rights were divided during the previous periods. And now Israel is using several formal legal tools, as I said, both formal and informal. The formal were the declaration of state land, expropriation to establish an archaeological site, and the allocation of municipal jurisdiction to the Jewish settlement, and also planning. So all that going layers upon layers of proceedings. And I will zoom in a few minutes I have to some processes. First of all, we have documents from a person who some called or termed the mother of the settlements, or the mother of settlement of title processes, declaration of state land, Plia Albeck, who was the head of the civil department of the Ministry of Justice and introduced many of the changes both in the, she started in the Galilee, she moved to occupied territories, and we find her also in the Negev, so she was a key person, but she was very meticulous, and we can see that, by the way, it's very difficult to get to this information. You have to fight. Information is not in the state archives, in the Ministry of Justice. You have to fight over every single document. They refuse to give it. They say it's too much work. So we have some, but not all the documents. She, in an initial opinion, she stated that there was private land in the region. And the question was what to do with the place that they wanted to make or to transform into a settlement. So between 1982 and 1983, there were three what is called declaration of state land, the Chaza al Admot Medina, and for the Palestinians, there were several barriers. First of all,
افتح الشاشة كمان عن أوسلو.
First of all, the Palestinians were unaware of the declaration for various reasons, and there were very difficult evidentiary barriers. For example, the onus of proof was laid on the land claimants, and Israel brought expert opinion, a lot of aerial photos that were not available to the Palestinians. When somebody claimed that the land belonged to him, because the land was owned by the Palestinians under Ottoman registration, but then Israel said you have to prove the exact registration, and Ottoman registration is not sufficiently exact. They introduced the rule which is based on section 78 of the Ottoman Land Code and its interpretation by Israeli courts that began in the Galilee. I wrote about it many years ago, which is called the 50% rule. That is, you have to prove that at least 50% of the land is cultivated in order to gain it as Miri land, cultivated Miri land. If you want, I don't know how many lawyers, I can explain that. And then the land was transferred first to the Istadrut HaTzionit, and this was done by the state, and this was done when an appeal was still pending. Another way was to expropriate the archeological site. So the site was recognized even before by the British, as early as 1944, but the Palestinians lived on the site. In 1986, the land was expropriated, and also it was not recognized as a village. Then the expropriation was again open. The archaeological site was open while an appeal was still pending. In fact, only 20 dunum out of almost 300 were excavated, and the Palestinian original village was preserved, but because it was declared as an archaeological site, they were expelled, and the area was transferred to the jurisdiction of the settlement, of the Jewish settlement that Susya, that is located near, and also by the management of the regional council, the Jewish regional council. So what we can see here is what I want to say is how different legal means are working to change the physical and legal status. Then 15 years after the actual establishment of the settlement, there was a declaration that the settlement was the jurisdiction, the municipal jurisdiction of the settlement, which includes the three declarations we viewed before, about 1,800 dunams, which were forbidden to the Palestinians, but there were private Palestinian land enclaves that remained, that were based on the reports by Pia Albeck. But then we have the illegal, so-called illegal by internal law, settlement outpost, including Mitzpeh Yael, and so this is also part of the overtaking the space. And then 16 years after the establishment, there is also a plan of the region. So if you look at the area, and this is where I'm going to conclude, if you see the area, we've seen in Hebrew, we put the names of the newer settlements, but as you can see, the geography, it's almost empty. And when we look at the situation today, well, we can see that there are now several Jewish settlements, and at the same time, however, we can see that Palestinians are overlooking their homes. Many of them are agriculturists living in shepherds living in caves. But what happened, in fact, is that the resistance, and this is, I could not talk about it now, is that they moved near the place to another place that belongs to them through land registration. and the struggle continues over this place. So I talked more about the transformation, the Judaization, but I want to just to stress in conclusion that it's not the end, because Palestinians are still, to a large degree, not all of them present in the area. So I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, so I'm glad to introduce Yael Berda. Yael now is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at the Hebrew University. She was an academy scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Regional Studies from 2014 to 2017. She received her PhD from Princeton University, MA from Tel Aviv University, LLB from the Hebrew University Faculty of Law. Yael was a practicing human rights lawyer representing in military, district, and Supreme Courts in Israel. Her most recent book is Living Emergency, Israel's Permit Regime in the West Bank, was published in the Stanford University Press in 2017. Yael currently is working on a book manuscript entitled The File and the Checkpoint, the Administrative Memory of the British Empire. Her other research projects are about the construction of loyalty of civil servants in Israel and India, the use of emergency laws to shape political economy of colonial states and colonial legacies of law and administration that shapes contemporary homeland security practices in a post-colonial state. Yael publishes, teaches, speaks on the intersections of sociology of law, bureaucracy and the state, race and racism, and sociology of the empires. Yael will talk in this session about citizenship as a mobility regime, a new paradigm for security, equal rights, and freedom of movement. Yael, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thanks so much for inviting me to this timely panel. I'm going to be a little bit brief. My internet connection is not great, and there's and it's noisy. So let's hope that it holds up just for at least to present and for questions. So I want to talk about thinking of citizenship. Can you hear?
Now we can.
Okay, so I want to talk about the way we think of citizenship in the context of Israel-Palestine, not only as rights, so who has legal or formal citizenship, but to think a little bit about how citizenship actually works practically in daily life. So who has the right to participate in political life? Who has the right to who has freedom of choice when it comes to shaping their own lives, shaping their own institutions, participating in what their life might look like? And I'm very interested in this because, and I want to tell you a little bit about my historical research as a background for this argument, but I want to devote a little bit of time about thinking also about the future and the horizon that this way of thinking provides us. Now, not necessarily horizon of what we would want as, as people that support universal human rights as they are understood today, but as what is possible. What are the possibilities for understanding rights? What are the possibilities for understanding citizenship in the context of coming out of the real conflict that is between Israelis and Palestinians at this moment? So, okay, so I'm gonna backtrack a little bit to explain how I'm thinking about this, and then I'm not really going to go into the historical aspect of my argument because I want to talk about the contemporary. So I'm just gonna give a little bit of the, I'm gonna talk about the argument, but I'm not gonna go into the empirical evidence for it. So I think that the status of the Palestinians of 48 is central to understanding the current one-state reality in which the Israeli government rules the undetermined political borders of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza. The Israeli government controls populations in this area through a sophisticated, graded, and racialized matrix of political membership in which one's political status, identity, and territorial location determine their political rights, which laws apply to them, and perhaps primarily their possibilities for mobility. So the contemporary one-state reality is the outcome or culmination, not necessarily the repudiation, of the long process of partition from the British colonial partition plan for Palestine that never happened, but that was endorsed by the international community. And I see that as a direct line to the failed Oslo process that was purported to be a pathway to the two-state solution. So I'm looking at it, I'm looking at partition, I'm looking at the Oslo Accord and its failure, the failed partition, failed Oslo Accord, and then this idea that what we have is a one-state reality that is the result of that. So post-independence, Israel was deeply affected by the legacies of the broader British imperial context, which we sometimes tend to forget how deeply, and this is something which legal historians, really live in this world. Sandy Kedar and others really live in this world in which, yes, it's obvious that Israel was a post-imperial entity, and most of its law, most of its administration were formulated on that basis, sometimes thinking as some of Ari Dubnov's work shows, as almost as another dominion of the British Empire, and sometimes simply thinking of it as a legacy, right? Continuity of law in order to ensure stability, in order to ensure the machinery of the state that existed during the mandate. Now, why do I think it's important to think and realize this is that when we look at Israel as, through the eyes of nation state eyes, without realizing its imperial past, and in ways it's a past that lives in its contemporary, it's much harder to understand its population management policies, the way it bureaucratically shapes political participation. So if we're thinking of it, and it's one of the reasons why people think, for instance, that Palestinian citizens of Israel actually have equal rights. Oh, they're citizens, therefore they have rights. But understanding the way empires work and colonial states work means that we know that one's formal status doesn't necessarily determine practice. It doesn't necessarily determine what they can do in their life. And vice versa. So there could be a range of wide possibilities that is open to the non-citizen. That subjecthood allows for Ottoman Empire. Those that study the Ottoman Empire know this better than I do, but that there's actually a range of being outside of the system, less roped into a system that allows for a range of possibility and political participation. So I think one of the things that is helpful, and not just in recognizing, be it Israel as a settler colonial state or colonial practices, just from a political perspective, but as a research tool to understand how the administration works, even if it goes against what all its agents believe that they're doing, which is interesting in itself, and we can talk about that too. Okay. So post-independence, Israel was deeply affected by the legacies of the broader British imperial context. The British imperial toolkit of emergency more broadly shaped imperial formations in Israel-Palestine by creating a sophisticated system that linked this trinity, identity to mobility, and then exclusion from political rights. Population management practices and colonial emergency laws developed in the horizontal circuits of the British Empire as the central method of rule fundamentally shaped the realities governing citizenship and mobility. And it's also relevant, of course, to our time now as we're seeing this relationship between political status and mobility during the pandemic. That there's two layers, and the question about movement sometimes becomes much more important than the question of belonging. It also brings the question of belonging and its administrative effects to the forefront. But I think asking the question about how citizenship and mobility interact is a fruitful one. It's an interesting one. And for me, one of the things this idea comes from actually my research on Israel, India, and Cyprus in during the first decades of independence. And very recently, I was able to link it to my other work on the bureaucracy of the occupation in the West Bank. Because for a very long time, I saw these practices as different. So military government is a very different type of mobility regime than the current permanent regime in the occupied territories. And I want to talk a little bit about that for those that know less about the history. I'm not really going to delve into it because there is a lot of work on that, so there's no reason for me to reiterate. But very basically, 1949 to 1966, there's a military government that's in place first on Palestinian subjects, the Palestinian remainder that remains after the Nakba independence, and then of course in 1952, as Palestinians become citizens, they are under this military rule. That's the moment that I think is the most interesting, right? From 52, as Palestinians, they become citizens formally. Some might say, like Hassan Jabarin already talks about the fact that there's political participation. Palestinians participate in elections prior to this moment. I think it's in 49. But to me, and I'm very interested in bureaucracy itself, also the artifacts of bureaucracy, the documents, the regulations, the maps themselves, because these are what allows movement. That's what allows for mobility. It's the existence of the document itself, not necessarily the legal status in the abstract. Okay, so 1949 to 1966, you have this military government, which is basically its most important function is the function of prevention of mobility or regulating mobility, and creating a gradation of who can move when, who can move when and where, and who has authority to regulate movement. And you can see how this is a very unorganized machinery during the military government, and in that way it is very similar to the bureaucracy of the occupation, the permanent regime that is today a very, very sophisticated population management apparatus that administers Palestinians in the occupied territories, but its early years, a little bit prior to Oslo and then more heavily into the Oslo years, were a bureaucratic mayhem. And in that way it's very, very similar to the military government. What was very different is that citizenship, formal citizenship for the Palestinian remainder was not a question. It was an international requirement. It was something that had to be done. There was no way to achieve legitimacy for the nascent Israeli state without providing that legal status. However, there was very little intervention in the question of practice and the question of what do those rights entail. This is very, very different than the situation than the situation in the occupied territories, where because of that imaginary partition and the perpetuated imagination of the two states, at no point is there a requirement to grant citizenship to Palestinians, and the regulation of mobility is perceived also by the international community as part of Israel's prerogative of who it allows entry. So it's if we look at the prerogative of the sovereign who is allowed entry and exit, who is allowed entry, sorry, not exit. But also it's upheld. So this idea that mobility restrictions are part of Israel's security regime is accepted and perpetuated and enhanced by donors, by the international community, and even, challenged to some degree by maybe human rights organizations and international bodies, but not in any kind of deep way. There is no address of mobility as constitutive of political participation. And I think that's what interests me in the story. And what interests me in the story is, so just another part of the story, because what I'm really interested in is kind of telling you about this argument, because I think it's a fruitful one to, as a starting point. It's definitely not something that I think that people will agree upon, but I think it's a good way to begin to discuss what citizenship can mean in the Israeli-Palestinian context in any future arrangement, but also understanding today that gradation of, what does it mean when you have citizenship, political participation that is distributed by territory and by population. So it's not, we have the residents of East Jerusalem, we have citizens of Israel, but then we have the racial national divide between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel. And then we have other divides having to do with racial ethnic hierarchies and the hierarchies between periphery and center that then play into this type of matrix that is one that continues to work within a logic that I call the axis of suspicion. It's a logic that views people's identity as part of a loyalty regime. Who is loyal to the state and who is dangerous to the state. Now, as we can see even now, that can change. So if in the nascent years of the state, the loyalty that was in doubt was the loyalty of Palestinians, and loyalty of Jews was never questioned, or not questioned. In most cases, it was not questioned as a loyalty to the state. It was questioned as loyalty to political affiliations and factions. That definitely, yes. But we don't have this kind of paradigm of suspicion that can extend beyond the national identity, and that's something that's changing now, and we can see it changing. If anyone's interested in that argument, I have some work on that and the relationship to Israel's anti-terrorism laws and the way they play into this divide between loyalty and suspicion. But I don't want to go into that now. I do want to talk a little bit about emergency laws and their role in shaping citizenship as a mobility regime. Now, one other thing about emergency laws, and this is something that is true in Israel, but was also true in India for a very long time. What emergency laws allowed to do was to have a universal law that doesn't target specific populations, but what it does is it grants the administration the possibility to target specific population through their discretion, through practice, which is why legal status in itself doesn't tell you the story of people's ability to participate. What tells you the story of people's ability to participate is looking at daily practices and their interaction with the administrative state. So, and this is why I think also researching bureaucracy can be very useful in places where you have this disparity between a liberal body of law and a self-imagination of an existence of a democracy, and then practices that are based on racial or class hierarchies. It doesn't only have to work in when you have pronounced inequalities, but a system that perceives itself as being one of equity. And so when we have that disparity, I think one of the most useful things is looking at what actually happens. So not necessarily the declaration of law, but its enforcement. And then not just it's the way it is enforced from the point of view of its victims, but actually the enforcement through the point of view of the enforcers, through the military commanders, through the police, through the agents that have to manage the powers that they're given. We think of emergency powers as being a grant, but they're also a huge burden. Who are they a huge burden for? They're a burden for enforcement. You have this blanket, okay, you can go and arrest, do searches, seizures, stop people, create checkpoints, do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. Where do you deploy your resources? How do you choose the populations to target? How do you choose the places that you wish to confine? How do you choose who to quarantine? How do you choose who gets to move, who doesn't? At what time? What is the temporal rhythm of that? This is difficult. It's difficult for the agents to do. Now, one of the ways they get out of that difficulty is by creating categories and classifications. Now, this is not done out of nowhere, right? So discretion does come with a set of political principles, with a set of agendas, and also with the message from political leadership, what goals are to be achieved. However, when we look at the system itself, when we look at how it classifies and categorizes, and what those classifications and categories of population allow, in my case, in what I'm trying to convince you of, what it allows in terms of mobility, we can know a lot more about the content of political status, of participation, which is why I'm calling it citizenship as a mobility regime. The last point I want to make about this is about why I think this is useful actually as a paradigm of an alternative paradigm for security. And I think that one of the things that happen when we categorize based on legal and political status is that we're working with the logic of separation, the logic of partition, and it's a logic that's born from this very kind of anachronistic dichotomy, and this is something Catriona Drew writes about wonderfully, that in a way, the way self-determination of new states, the making of the nation state was understood in the situation of partition was that the other side of that was transfer. And then that translates to what Ehud Barak, when he was prime minister, talks about as anachnu sham hem kan. So we're here, they're there, and the separation becomes the political paradigm that then translates into a paradigm of security. But when you think about it more deeply, in a less anachronistic fashion of what is self-determination and how can it be realized, you don't have to have an idea of segregation. And as a matter of fact, I think Palestinian citizens of Israel, from the Israeli Jewish point of view, are the evidence for that. So your greatest security is to have equality before the law, even though there's no equality in practice. And then whoever are perceived as threats, and for many years, Palestinian citizens of Israel were not necessarily perceived as threats. In the recent Netanyahu regime, they are again perceived as threats, but definitely in terms of security, if you go into any room, be it the INSS or any other room, and you say, okay, let's talk about who are security threats, the threat, Palestinian citizens of Israel would not be discussed as a security threat in the same way as Palestinians in the territories or Palestinians in Gaza. Now, one of the reasons is that the separation, the segregation, and the prevention of mobility create a security threat. They create a security threat because they prevent the possibility of integration. They prevent the possibility of participation. And within that, what they create is this binary in which being on the other side means that you must be part of the enemy. And this is an idea that happened in partition between India and Pakistan as well. So part of this idea of the treatment of the Muslim minorities in India has to do with the fact, with the imagination, that here are people that belong to the enemy state. They belong to the other side of the border. And that in itself creates the sense of having no option of belonging. There's one option, and it's to belong to the enemy, she who is on the other side. Now, what happens when we do have a system of open mobility? It doesn't mean that we solve enmity. It doesn't mean that we solve the real and absolutely real conflict there is about land, about water, about power, about settlement, about distribution of resources. No, we don't stop that. But what we do prevent is the threat that separation creates in itself. And it allows for a much wider range of possibilities in which you can have a matrix of political status and mobility, but one that allows people to fully participate in life itself, if one wishes. We have this in Hebrew. It's become a joke. So the participation of life itself is actually one that enables a dialogue between political status, and so mobility allows that dialogue between political status and participation in life itself. Now, one of the things that are interesting about thinking about one open space in which there is full mobility, is that the amount of resource that it takes to classify and manage population in this fashion is either very, very big, so this is huge, massive resources that one needs to deploy in order to make the system effective. And this is one last point that I want to make. The system. So I call this effective inefficiency, and it's kind of manifested also during the use of surveillance mechanisms used on the Palestinian population in the occupied territory, now on Israeli citizens, to monitor the corona spread. So one of the things about the system, the bureaucracy of the occupation, is that it's not an effective one. Why is it not an effective one? Because it classifies a quarter of a million people as security threats, which they're obviously not. Because it is not exact, because it never really targets the security threat in itself. What it does manage to do is slow down mobility, is create a surveillance system in which, yes, there is a huge possibility for information and for control that then allow for prevention of various activities, but they also prevent all daily activities. They also prevent they also prevent political organization. They also prevent economic development. So thinking, I think at this moment, with what we have now, and thinking the way mobility opens up the possibility for different types of relationships, and for a new thinking about what security could mean, is something that is not, it's not only necessary, but it's also fruitful. It allows us to imagine things differently, coming out of the truisms of segregation, separation, and the prevention of mobility as security, into looking at the mobility regime that currently exists, and asking ourselves, is this what we would like, and what are possibilities to get out of it? Thank you.
Very much to Dr. Yael Berda. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Amal Zuabi, who is an architect and urbanist. Amal holds a B.Arch from Bezalel Academy for Art Design and a master's in rehabilitation of buildings with historical value, Erasmus combined Spain and Italy. Amal is currently the coordinator, Area C in Bimkom, Planners for Planning Rights. She worked previously in private offices and originally joined Bimkom in 2003 as a planner. She is also a mother of two and lives in Jerusalem. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. Sorry that I don't have a video camera, so you'll have just to hear my voice. Okay, I'm gonna share my presentation.
Great, thanks.
Perfect. Okay, so obviously some subjects were interacted with other lecturers. So, and I have a long presentation, so I'll try to skip some slides. You'll have to excuse me. So I'm going to be talking about planning policy in West Bank, preventing development for Palestinians. And I'm going to start with the period before Oslo, of course, just a background about the techniques and policy. Of course, about state lands, it was spoken about. It's just important for me to say that it's about 40% of West Bank is state lands. And majorly, it's exclusively to be used by Israeli settlers, none for Palestinians. Previously, a person could apply for planning permit in West Bank directly after the occupation, starting the 70s, based on the Jordanian planning law. And you could get a permit based on the plan of the Mandatorian plan. But the problem is that there was another military order, 418, which substituted this planning system and made it only for a higher planning council with its subcommittees for Palestinians. And while for Israelis settlers, they made a special planning committee back at 75. So they had totally different planning system. Still, Palestinians could get planning permits based on the Mandatorian plans, which were planned back in 40s. Which these plans mainly allowed building almost everywhere in special conditions, of course. So Palestinians could get permits based on that. Now, Israel was trying to delimit the development of these Palestinian villages, so they initiated special outline plans. This is something very unique in planning system. It doesn't exist in the Jordanian planning law. And its aim is to limit the development of the Palestinian communities, villages, while leaving areas for the expansion of settlements. About 400 special outline plans were planned for Palestinians between 1989 and 1995. These plans were minimal in their details. They included very small areas, mostly built-up areas. They have high density, low level of details, and of course, it never included any state land. Just to have a clue about building permits back in that time, Palestinians could apply for permits. As an average, it was high in the beginning. Back in 72, about 3,000 applications were submitted for building permits. From that, about 97% were approved. And of course, it started decreasing along the years. Israel was still trying all the time to control overlands. Back, if we look at the left side of the slide, in here you see the yellow polygons. These are the built-up areas of the settlements. That was before Oslo, of course. These settlements are covering an area of about like 2% of the West Bank. But the hidden layers show something different. If we take a look in here, the jurisdiction area of these settlements is about 10% area of West Bank, and the regional council area is about 40% of the West Bank. This actually led to Oslo and led to the fragmentation of the West Bank. If we take a short look about the control was direct by declaring state lands, municipal, local and regional council, and discriminatory planning policy. Now, after Oslo, if we take a look about the fragmentation, there were about 200,000 Palestinians living in Area C, about 70,000 of them living in 240 villages, which are located completely in Area C. Their built-up area is in Area C, and 200 more that are partly in Area C and partly in areas A and B. If we go back to special planning, the outline plans, we can see that today they are located mostly in areas A and B. If we take a look about all over planning area for Palestinians, it's about 0.5% only of Area C of those plans, while for settlements, it's about 26% of Area C. This is just a glimpse about how does a special outline plan look alike. This is the line comparing to a settlement plan. If we conclude approved plans for settlements all over Area C is about 5.5%, while for Palestinians it's about 0.34%. If we take a look about the comparison of building permits before Oslo and after Oslo, we can see the decrease, like a dramatic decrease in applications for building permits and for approval. Back in the 70s, 80s, the average of applications for building permits were about 1,500 or 2,000 applications per year. while in the 2000s, it's about 200 or less than 200 applications per year, and we can see that mostly 1% only is approved. Now, of course, as a solution, Palestinian communities started suffering from lack of planning and lack of permits. So there was an initiative of community-driven outline plans. It was started actually 2010. These plans actually, something like 106 plans were prepared, submitted for a population of about 98,000 people, covering an area of 72,000 dunams. But eventually only 76 were submitted to ICA, to the Israeli Civil Administration. Only 12 among them were published for objections, and eventually only 4 got approved. Of course, these plans were suffering from long bureaucracy, and most of them had very technical changes and demanding changes all the time, but never got approved. Of course, no planning means no permits, means demolitions. Between years of 1995 and 2000, about 18,600 demolition orders were issued. From that, about 4,000 demolitions were executed. Of course, 4,000 demolitions doesn't mean 4,000 structures, because often demolition can include more than one building, 1, 2, 3, meaning this could be duplicated or tripled by a number of structures. Of course, Israel was trying all the time to kind of evacuate Area C from Palestinians, and this led to the forcible transfer plans made for Bedouins, the mobile pastoralists, who originally actually came from the south, from the Negev, after the occupation, when they were kicked or transferred from their hometowns. So this is an example of the plan made in El Jabal for the Jahalin tribe for about 150 families. It was planned back in 1996 as a first attempt to evacuate people from Ma'ale Adumim area for the benefit of establishing of the settlement. Ever since, there was an attempt to regulate Bedouins. So the High Court actually announced that you could actually transfer or displace Bedouins only after offering a proper planning offer for them. So what Israel was trying to create all the time is cleaning of areas, Area C, creating draconian tools of such action. If we take a look at this chart, we see the demolition orders in blue, the actual demolitions in orange. Of course, we see peak lines regarding, let's say, 2003, close to the separation barrier. There were several causes for increasing demolitions. It's important to say that about 75% of demolitions actually occurred on private lands, Palestinian private lands. Of course, all the time, Israel is trying to make pressure over Palestinians, and this is an example for buildings that are in a petition with demolition orders, of course, in the area close to Abu George, if it's close to like northeast to Ma'ale Adumim. They applied an unfair consent for the people there, for the communities, suggesting to erase the petition and temporarily to stop the demolitions in condition to fill this form, which includes very personal private details with a very sensitive information that of course could be used in different manners. And in the same time, they would agree not to make any change on ground, meaning not to build, not to develop, nothing. And of course, at the same time, it included an agreement for alternative planning by the ICA, meaning they would agree to be transferred. Of course, this was not accepted and people didn't really cooperate with this. Of course, all these tools of cleaning Area C would affect mainly the mobile pastoralists in those areas. There's about 35% of inhabitants in about 180 communities of mobile pastoralists all along Area C. So Israel is trying all the time to draw new facts on the ground and inventing techniques to prevent them from development. Basically, of course, stop working orders, demolition orders, confiscation orders for mobile structures or building materials, which of course would have no would have no option of legal action to protect.
Wow.
The military order number 1797, which allows destruction of new buildings within 96 hours without any legal action, unless you get a building permit, which is of course impossible. Of course, here a new structure, meaning any structure within 6 months old prior to the issuing of the order. They can come anytime and just dismantle the buildings, the structures. We have also the demarcation or delimitation order. For example, in Jabal al-Baba in here, despite the fact that all the buildings have demolition orders, still all of them together have the demarcation order, which allows this allows the ICA to, if in any case anybody decides to change anything in the building or make a new building, a new structure, it allows to dismantle or destroy the whole area within this demarcation line. I would conclude as a summary that Israel is aiming to minimize Palestinians using the lands and the resources, of course. It's increasing fragmentation, it's cleaning the vast areas of Area C from Palestinians, strengthening at the same time the occupying power of the settlements, and turning like new facts on the ground as unchangeable actions. It seems like it's heading to annexation, and we're trying to, in our work, we're trying to give support to the localities and communities in Area C regarding this in two different ways. One is the responsive, which is trying to change the policy regarding special plans, objections against some plans, and of course for transfer plans against demolitions. And the other one is the proactive, which is offering a future vision, like a hope for these people, offering guideline planning as a solution for some areas. For example, I would give Khirbat al-Wain al-Fawqa, which is in South Hebron Hills, just in here. It's of course one of the places that might be affected in case of annexation. This village is located over an archaeology area, polygon. It's there ever since, I don't know, hundreds of years. They live there in caves. They used to live there in caves. And just recently, back in the 19th, they started building up, as they call it, growing above the earth. So Israel is trying to evacuate them from their spot based on the fact that there are archaeology in the site. We help these people against an appeal, like within their appeal against demolition orders and evacuation. But then we planned, of course, a guideline planning idea along with them. We believe in combining people with their future vision in their planning, participatory planning. And we thought to give them an option of development based on the fact that there are archaeology, to use it as something, an asset actually to benefit the community instead of causing their transfer. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We're officially almost out of time, but we do want to take at least a couple of questions and have some time for discussion. I see that we have a question or comment from Dr. Itamar Man. So we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentations a lot, as I did in the previous session that we had. So I have a kind of thought regarding Yael's presentation. And I also would like a simple clarification from a very simple question for Amal Zuabi. And I'll start from the latter. Amal, you show the table of confirmed licenses for building. Hello?
Yeah.
Before and during, or before and after the Oslo agreements. And I found that that particular slide very, very striking. I would be happy if you would both just clarify what we saw in that slide and also give some interpretation for what seems like an enormously dramatic decrease in building opportunities for Palestinians. What is this? What are the reasons for this? And how is the factual analysis behind this graph done? Okay, with regard to Yael, I guess it's a little bit more of a conversation question, so I don't know if you have time for this, but just very briefly, your analysis with regard to movement rights and the kind of suggestion that this is a basis for citizenship and not only just formal political participation reminds me a little bit of Marx's analysis in the Jewish question, where he kind of attacks the liberal understanding of political participation as separated from the kind of material distribution behind the opportunity, the formal allocation of participation opportunities. So I was wondering if that is also something that this analogy strikes a chord with your research more generally. Is it kind of basically the move that you're trying to do? And also how it pertains, I guess, to two relatively large, I guess, historical examples. One is the freedom of movement the European Union tried to institute as, I guess, a very, very central part of European citizenship within the Union. And I think that experiment in institutional design is at least a partial failure. And on the other hand, a colleague from abroad recently asked me, how does intranational limitations of movement inside the territory of Israel-Palestine, how do they inform the intranational limitations of movement that we're now seeing in many countries around the world in the context of the coronavirus? So in other words, the underlying premise was that other countries can learn from our experience in this field of setting kind of movement barriers within our territory. So I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that.
Let me unmute. So totally, thank you so much for those. They're not really questions; they're like an ongoing conversation. But so this is gonna sound a little weird, but I always consider like the 20th century as the Jewish century, in the sense like kind of the Jewish question being so incredibly present in shaping history. And the idea of rights, right? So the idea of needing rights and national rights and self-determination as a protection for your life, right? So in that most kind of turning the protection of human rights in having that political embodiment that is so, I think, salient for no matter what your ideas about Israel as a Jewish state. I think most of us completely agree that the question of having a safe haven or having a place where your rights are guaranteed or so have been shaped by that history. And then I keep thinking of this century as the Palestinian century, and 2020 as being the year in which the world experiences being Palestinian. The entire world asks itself, can I go here? Can I go there? Who will let me? Who will confine me? How will I move? How will I see my parents? How will I make a living? Can I go study? Will they allow me? And you realize, right? And for me, I mean, I always get chills when I think about it, because I think so much of Palestinian experience is impossible to convey because it constantly is framed as this national and this self-determination and this liberation. And I'm not, and by my tone is not at all derogatory. What I mean to say is, in this, what it has meant to be Palestinian, to live within this set of structure, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your dedication to freedom or liberation or rights or your undedication to it, it doesn't even matter. But I think that so the way I'm thinking of it, and I think, yes, I think Marx's Jewish question is in the background more in a structural sense, right? So how do we think of mobility as capital? It's also kind of a Bourdieu, a way to think of mobility as capital, possibility of movement. And I just think that our ability to look at that, again, regardless of our opinion, but our ability to divorce ourselves with the idea of status and of rights as a declaration. And also as, like a lot of sociologists perceive citizenship to be like this thing about imagined communities. Now, imagined communities is for the majority. The minority doesn't busy itself with its imagination. It needs to live. And so for me, that's a big part of it. And look, and just at the, like we say, b'shulei advarim. So the question of the European Union is a little complicated, because on one sense, it is looking at the issue of mobility as being central, but it first looked at it as an economic organization, right? So first we have the economic cooperation, which then translates into mobility, and the reasoning for that mobility is not necessarily political participation, but economic facilitation.
Yeah, but I think that you do the same thing in a way, connecting mobility to a kind of capital, as you said.
I agree, and then, but the question is, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to connect it to political capital. or political participation, not economic one. It is perhaps too functional, too utilitarian, doesn't take into consideration a lot of, the more principled political structures and agreements that need to happen when in political communities. I totally agree with that and I accept it. And I don't know how, I think it's an extra layer that, once I figure this part out, maybe I can talk on that level or we'll talk on that level. But thank you so much for the question.
Okay, so now Amal Zuabi. We also had a question for Amal.
Yes, I'm sharing the screen just to show the chart. I believe that you were talking about this chart, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, perfect. So the issue here, I'm sorry for speaking fast previously because I had a lot of things to talk about and a short time. So I'm glad that you asked about this information. The thing here is there's a comparison between the era before Oslo and after Oslo. Of course, I just mentioned the potential for getting permits, building permits before Oslo by the Mandatorian plans and the special outline plans that was prepared by the ICA. Of course, these plans, the special outline plans, were aiming to delimit the potential for development. Meaning, first of all, they didn't often include all the built-up area. And so we see often that some structures are remaining outside of the polygon. And besides, there's the fact that we're talking about private lands. As a system, they don't really build for others. So everybody would want to build on his own land. Eventually, people start building either illegally or asking for permits outside of the border of those plans. And this way, they won't get permits. Of course, along the delimitation of development by Israel, and along with the community-driven plans also promoted by Palestinians that we could see, I showed before, as only 4 out of 106 were actually approved, meaning that the others couldn't get any, couldn't allow any permits for buildings. In this sense, people found it, first of all, very expensive to apply for permits that they have no hope to actually get. And it's also long procedures often that lead to nowhere. So this is mainly the explanation about the decrease of the permits. If you need numbers, I will just repeat that. Back in 70s, like 72, there were 3,000 applications, 97% approved. The average of this era before Oslo was about 1,500 or 2,000 applications per year, while today or recently, it's about only 200 applications per year, and only 1% would be approved. And of course, this would be included only on approved plans, which are rarely existing. I hope I did answer.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have a question from Professor Amnon Reichman. Please.
Very briefly, yeah, thank you very much for those two interesting, quite fascinating presentations. I want to focus, I think, Amal, you made a very convincing expression, I guess, of the impact of Oslo. And in a way, if we have to put Oslo in a historical context, then Oslo, in a way, Oslo was a trigger for policies that made it way worse than were before. And I think we have to theorize and talk about the conceptual structure, perhaps in greater detail somewhere else. But I think the evidence you provide is very convincing. I want to again ask Yael about the theoretical structure with which to approach very briefly your point about the regulation of space and people within space, because I agree with you that movement is central. I'm not sure about whether it was Jewish or Palestinian vis-a-vis your exchange with Itamar, because I think there are elements of the Jewish experience that also very much relate to where can I go, where that just before that, when Jews were in the diaspora as well, like the Palestinians are now, or part of the Palestinian people is now. But putting that aside in terms of who, allocation of whether it's a Jewish question or not, I'm going to put all this aside. But I think that what I'm missing here is the element of friction. And in here I connect to Sandy's work and some other work that was done with respect to law and geography. And part of the way we can understand borders is through the notion of friction, because borders or types of borders, different types of borders generate different types of friction. Bureaucratic friction, which person gets what permit to move where, that's a type of friction. How many times do I have to apply? How long does it take for this to be approved? This is a form of social friction. So perhaps perhaps part of, maybe it's a friendly amendment, part of what you mean by freedom of movement must entail this notion of friction.
That's great, and I think I've had a lot of exchanges with the SDS crowd with about friction as a social idea. I'm looking at it from an organizational standpoint. So for me, bureaucracy is not just a means to achieve politics. Bureaucracy makes politics. That's why emergency law are so important in the creation of this movement regime, because what they allow is the bureaucracy to make the law. They allow the bureaucrats to make the law, to create it. And so in that sense, I don't look, and also, I don't research borders because we don't really have any with the Palestinians. It's part of this interesting thing, right? We don't have a border with Palestine.
We have different types of borders, right? If you need this form of a border, right?
So it's only a form of a border if you conceive of it as being separate. So from a colonial perspective, right, what you have is you have different territories and different subjects, and people with different categories of different populations on this territory. But in terms of the rule of it, Israel rules the entire territory, and we can talk about the role of the Palestinian Authority, yes or no. We can talk about the role of the Palestinian Authority, yes or no. We could talk about the role of different organizations in Jerusalem as authority, but you have one authority that basically decides on the rules of the game. And then within it, you have different bureaucratic bodies that make these rules. So to me, the civil administration is the most interesting body, also because it really does try and be both. It tries to be both the government of the territories, and then it tries to give up its authority, right? And then it can't, because the Intifada, breaks up the double-headed bureaucracy that Oslo creates. And so you have all this, you could call it friction, but it's not around a border. It's around the management of population. So to me, there are no borders in Israel. It doesn't have any legal borders. We know this. That's one of the reasons. It's because we have the dispute. The only thing that is undisputed is basically the partition or armistice line. And, we can talk about the border with Egypt, or we could talk about the border with Jordan. That's not necessarily, there are interesting parts of that too, but to me, what's much more interesting is freedom of movement within this one territory, which I perceive as being similar to the way, different imperial territories were ruled. So it also has to do with the fact that I don't think through the two-state paradigm, because I never saw it happen. So, because the partition didn't happen, and then there was no Palestinian state. So I don't look at it as a border. Now,
just one conceptual comment. Borders are not just international borders. Borders are within municipalities, within certain areas. you know, the
No
borders are not
question.
just,
No,
okay.
no,
That's
no,
my point, right? That's the point.
no question, no argument about that. Absolutely, completely with you on the differences of zones and jurisdictions and all these things. I do think that when we're talking about international borders and the way there's a perception of the West Bank as international border, it's definitely contested on a practical level, even if it's not from the standpoint of international law. All right. Last thing, though, I think that one very interesting thing that is never talked about is how the permit regime is also an international regime, because Palestine, because there's this whole issue of, okay, what do you do with people coming in, but they want to come in to work with Palestinians, or they want to come into Palestine, and then this whole range. So I'm thinking now that maybe the permit regime is also an international regime. And one has to think about it in that way. And that is really kind of disconcerting in the way that you're talking about. So next chapter, I'll tell you. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you very much. We have one last question from Professor Oniftakhel, who's with us. Could you just unmute yourself, or maybe the host can unmute you?
Mute. Thank you for Haifa University for this important seminar and very eye-opening presentations. I mean, Yael Berda took us rather far to the regimes of mobility, but I want to take us maybe a step back, something more classical, which is the regime of property. Which of course quite often it's the basis for the nation state, the basis for the ruling elites, the basis for allocating rights at least in the global north. And I want to ask perhaps Sandy and Amal about their experience, and to connect to the good discussion about the new forms of citizenship or civil status. Really, it's not even citizenship, it's the gradation of civil status under the 21st century regime, which is not just the Palestinians, Yael, is many people around the world, hundreds of millions that are, living in shacks, in informal settlements without, security, but it is definitely the 21st century regime. So what do Sandy and Amal say from the experience of the West Bank about the connection between property and civil status? Well, I think that's very, very important also for the future of people in the West Bank. For legal geography, like Sandy was saying, is so critical, especially with the hanging threat of annexation and the future regime, the future or present apartheid happening in the West Bank. Is perhaps your intake from your research on that?
Okay, shall I take it first with Rotem? Okay, so thank you for your question. So first of all, I think we can talk about gradations of citizenship and gradations of space or spatial rights. They're all working together. So you have, when we talk about Palestinians, you have questions of what is ownership, and if we talk about the presentation of Amal, so what is, can you talk about ownership of the Jahalin, or because the ownership is actually in the Negev, but they were transferred. So there is something we should talk about, territorial rights more generally, and then it is much more connected to gradations of citizenship. And then, of course, you have the work of, of the Israeli regime or the administration, where they are working it's a differential system. Okay, so when you come and you are a Palestinian, you have to prove the onus is on you to prove that you have any kind of rights. If you are when your land is confiscated, it is transferred to settlers because they are Israelis. And also the whole system of jurisdiction, what kind of laws are applying to you, what kind of in the creation of municipal areas, all that is connected, is embedded in the creation of a spatial citizenship, if you want. I mean, they're all very much connected, and in my view, mobility regime is part of this kind of control of space. So the two major parameters that I will say as grand from a legal geography perspective, in that sense, will be replying to your question, will be gradations of citizenship and gradations of spatial rights, even more than property. So just to conclude, give you an example of which is more about mobility, but I think that we renovate part of our house now. So the major contractor is Jewish, and then we have the guy who is bringing the workers is actually from Jaljulia, I think. And then he has a sub-person, he's an Arab Israeli, and then he has somebody that works with him. And today I was talking to him that I discovered that he is actually originally from the Jiflik, but and then moved to Tulkarem, but married to, 25 years ago, he married a Palestinian Israeli Arab woman. And he brings the Palestinian workers. I talked with a Palestinian worker that is came here. He come from Tulkarem, and ask him every time. Ask him how they changing, and ask him how long did you stand in the checkpoint, and he said, "What checkpoint? I moved in 5 minutes." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, so he explained to me that the Israelis are now opening new places in the fence so Palestinians can move faster for some reason because of economic reasons. So he didn't stand in there. So you have here that the whole system of movement, just a movement regime based on gradations of citizenship. But I will conclude here. And my shower that is not yet ready.
All right, Amal, would you like to add something?
Actually, this question is a bit difficult because I think you have to be a lawyer in order to know how to attack this issue. And besides, we talk about assumptions in this stage. So I would just mention that nowadays we see private lands in settlement areas closed, of course, to their owners. We see that there are restrictions in getting close to security borders. If it was the separation barrier, the regional council of settlement, this would affect definitely access and land resources, especially if we're talking about grazing lands for mobile pastoralists. And we can see from the very first glimpse that we had of the annexation plans in different versions, you could see that it's not only affecting the villages, towns that are within the annexation area, because sometimes these villages have their service area inside the future Palestine, meaning they're left with no service at all. And the contrary, some of the Palestinians that would remain in the Palestinian future country or state would have their grazing lands or agricultural lands, their private lands on the annexed part. Of course, this is very confusing, and you can never tell if the same thing as East Jerusalem story would be repeated in such communities and villages. The status of being not being a citizen, but having the option of staying legally in those areas. Again, these are all assumptions, we can never tell, but of course, all the Palestinian community inside the annexation part and inside the future Palestinian state would be really badly affected in all manners.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for joining us, and I would like to thank our three panelists, Professor Sandy Kedar, Dr. Yael Berda, and Zuabi, for three fascinating presentations. Before we go, let me just remind you that on Wednesday, we're meeting again at 4 o'clock for the 2 final panels of our conference, and I hope very much to see you all there as well to continue our discussion. Thank you, and good evening or good day if you're somewhere else in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.